For nearly 2,000 years, millions of people believed the house of the Apostle Peter had been lost forever. A simple place, probably small, somewhere near the waters of the Sea of Galilee, where a Jewish fisherman once lived before becoming one of the most recognized names in the history of Christianity. And honestly, if someone had told me a few years ago that modern archaeologists might actually uncover traces of that place, I probably would have thought it sounded impossible. It feels too unbelievable, almost like the plot of a movie. But now, researchers in Israel claim they may have discovered something extraordinary buried beneath an ancient Byzantine church. And what makes this story even more fascinating is that it is not coming from random internet pages or sensational blogs. We are talking about real archaeologists, official excavations, universities, Greek inscriptions, archaeological studies, and respected international media covering the discovery seriously. But did they really find the home of a man who once walked beside Jesus? Could a place like that truly survive for 2,000 years? Or is there something even more mysterious hidden behind this excavation? And I'll be honest with you, when I first started researching this story, I assumed it would just be another interesting archaeological headline. That was it. But the deeper I looked into it, the stranger everything became. Because some of the things discovered there simply should not exist the way they do. Especially when you realize that Christians many centuries ago already believed this exact location was connected to Peter long before modern archaeology even existed. And that thought stayed in my mind for a long time. Because it is one thing for modern researchers to create a theory. It is something completely different for people living in the 5th century to build an enormous church directly above that location because they believed something sacred had once existed there. The story begins in one of the most important regions mentioned in the Gospels, the Sea of Galilee. This is where Jesus called fishermen to follow him. This is where many of the most famous moments in the New Testament took place. And this is also where Bethsaida once stood, a fishing village directly associated with Peter, Andrew, and Philip. For centuries, historians and archaeologists tried to determine where this ancient village was actually located. At first, that sounds simple, but it really is not. Because time changes rivers, shorelines move, cities disappear, and entire civilizations become buried beneath layers of earth. For a long time, many scholars believe the real Bethsaida was located at another archaeological site called Et-Tel. But there was a problem. Some archaeologists began questioning whether that location truly made sense for a fishing village because it appeared too far from the water. Then came El-Araj, a site near the Sea of Galilee that started attracting more and more attention over the last several years. Excavations intensified around 2016, and that is when things became truly fascinating. Researchers uncovered evidence of Roman period occupation, ancient walls, fishing-related artifacts, coins, and signs of a Jewish settlement that existed during the same time Peter would have lived there. Even that alone would already be significant. But then came the discovery that completely changed the scale of the story. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of an ancient Byzantine church. And not just any church. Some researchers began to suspect this could actually be the long-lost Church of the Apostles mentioned in ancient Christian pilgrimage accounts. Now think about that for a moment. Early Christians traveled thousands of miles to visit locations associated with Jesus and the apostles. And some ancient writings described a church built over the home of Peter and Andrew in Bethsaida. For centuries, many historians believe this could never truly be verified. But now, centuries later, archaeologists discover the remains of an ancient church in that exact region. And what happened next shocked researchers even more. During the excavations, they uncovered extremely ancient mosaic floors containing Greek inscriptions. One inscription in particular drew worldwide attention. According to researchers connected to the excavation project, the text referred to Peter as the chief and commander of the heavenly apostles. When I first read that, I honestly sat in silence for a few seconds. Because imagine the weight of that discovery. People living more than 1,500 years ago preserved that location and created inscriptions honoring Peter directly there. Can you imagine the emotional impact of watching letters buried beneath the earth for centuries slowly emerge into the light again? And it did not stop there. Researchers also discovered older walls beneath the church itself, structures dating back to the 1st century, the exact period when Peter would have lived. And this is where the story begins to feel almost surreal. Some archaeologists suggested that early Christians may have intentionally preserved those older structures because they believed they belonged to the original home of the apostle. Now, honestly, if that were true, can you imagine how historically important that would be? To think that a humble fisherman's house may have survived wars, empires, earthquakes, destruction, and still left enough traces behind for people 2,000 years later to search for it. But this is where I think honesty becomes extremely important. Not all archaeologists agree with these conclusions. And I really want to make that clear. There is still debate. There are disagreements among scholars. Some researchers continue defending other possible locations for biblical Bethsaida. Others argue that the evidence is not yet strong enough to definitively identify the site as Peter's home. And honestly, I think that makes the story even more believable. Real archaeology works this way. It is not built on instant certainty. It is built on evidence, analysis, theories, comparisons, and constant debate. Yet even with those disagreements, one thing is becoming harder and harder to ignore. The collection of discoveries at this site is extraordinary. We are talking about a 1st century Jewish fishing village near the Sea of Galilee, Byzantine church remains, Greek inscriptions connected to Peter, and ancient walls beneath the church itself. The more pieces you place together, the harder it becomes to dismiss the possibility that something incredibly important. One statement from the researchers involved in the excavation really stayed with me. One archaeologist reportedly said something very close to, "The stones speak to us." And honestly, the more I researched this story, the more that sentence made sense. Because that is exactly what this discovery feels like. As if fragments of the past are still trying to tell a story. As if the buried remains beneath the earth still carry memory. Now imagine the scene for a moment. An archaeologist carefully brushing away layers of dirt beneath an ancient church. Dust rising into the air. Broken stones. Ancient mosaics slowly appearing beneath the soil. Greek letters emerging after centuries hidden underground. And suddenly someone realizes the inscription mentions Peter. Can you imagine the silence in that moment? Because even scientists trained to remain emotionally detached must have felt the historical weight of what they were uncovering. And there is another detail here that I think many people overlook. The Byzantine church was not built there randomly. That is extremely important. Constructing a church of that size during that period required enormous effort, resources, labor, planning. Which raises an unavoidable question. Why there? Why did Christians centuries ago choose that exact location? What did they believe existed beneath it? Could ancient traditions about Peter's home have survived through generations until that place became sacred to early believers? I find that possibility deeply fascinating because we often imagine biblical history as something disconnected from physical reality, almost like it belongs entirely to another world. But discoveries like this suddenly remind us that these people were real human beings. They walked through real villages, lived inside real homes, worked with their hands, ate meals at tables, looked out over the same waters of Galilee. Peter was not a mythological character to the people who knew him. He was a real fisherman, a real man who likely never imagined that 2,000 years later people around the world would still be searching for traces of his life. And honestly, Peter may be one of the most human figures in the entire Bible. He failed. He doubted. He became afraid. He sank into the water when his faith wavered. He denied Jesus 3 times. Yet somehow, he still became one of the central figures of Christianity. So imagining archaeologists excavating a place that may once have been his home creates an emotional connection that is difficult to explain. Because suddenly the story becomes less abstract. You start wondering, what if Peter actually walked here? What if he stood near these waters? What if these walls existed while Jesus himself visited this region? Now, of course, there is always danger in exaggeration online, which is why I wanted to look directly into the sources connected to the excavation. Some of the strongest reports came from researchers associated with the El-Araj project, along with archaeological organizations and respected international publications. And one thing that appears repeatedly in these reports is caution. Researchers are not simply shouting, "We found Peter's house." The way dramatic headlines often suggest, what they are actually saying is that the evidence strongly supports the possibility that this location was venerated by early Christians as the home of Peter and Andrew. And honestly, even that alone is incredible. Because think about the historical significance of identifying a location that Christians in the 5th century already considered sacred because of its connection to the apostles. Even if absolute proof never appears, even if archaeologists never uncover some ancient plaque saying Peter lived here, the existence of such ancient traditions connected to this site is already extraordinary. There is also another fascinating detail. Some researchers argue that El-Araj makes far more geographic sense as a fishing village than previously proposed locations because it lies much closer to the water. That detail might sound small at first, until you realize those are exactly the kinds of details archaeologists use to reconstruct ancient history. Little by little, the puzzle pieces begin fitting together. And the more you think about it, the stranger it feels. Because for almost 2,000 years, the world has heard stories about Peter through sermons, paintings, churches, books, films, and scripture. But now there is a possibility that physical traces of the environment where he lived may still exist beneath the earth itself. Do you think it could really be real? Honestly, part of me still struggles between fascination and caution. Because one side of me says, this is too extraordinary. But another side also recognizes that archaeology requires patience and honesty. Yet at the same time, the more evidence appears, the harder it becomes to completely dismiss the possibility that something remarkable truly exists there. And maybe the most powerful part of this story is not the walls, or the mosaics, or even the inscriptions. For me, the most emotional part is realizing that Christians many centuries ago apparently tried to preserve the memory of that place. That deeply moves me, because it means generations of people looked at that location and believed something important happened here. Someone who changed history once lived here. And then I start wondering something else entirely. How many other places connected to biblical history are still buried beneath the earth waiting to be discovered? Because the deeper archaeology advances, the more discoveries seem to connect the biblical world to physical history. And I do not mean that science somehow proves faith in a simplistic way. That is not what this is about. But it does remind us that the world of the Bible existed in real places, involving real cities, real cultures, real people. And perhaps that is why discoveries like this feel so emotional. They bring the ancient world closer to our reality. They remind us that these stories did not happen in some distant mythical universe. They happened in real homes, real villages, among ordinary people. Now imagine this scene for a moment. A simple fisherman returning home after spending the entire night working on the Sea of Galilee. Exhausted, probably worried about food, money, survival, with no idea that history was about to change forever. Then one day Jesus enters his life and everything changes. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall. Wars reshape civilizations. Entire kingdoms disappear. Yet people are still searching the earth trying to find traces of that man. That is astonishing to me, and maybe that is exactly why this discovery has attracted so much global attention. Because deep down it touches something profoundly human inside people. The idea that the past still speaks. The idea that places once thought lost forever may still carry memory beneath the ground. And perhaps we may never have complete certainty. Archaeologists may continue debating this for decades. New evidence may emerge. Some theories may change entirely. That is how archaeology works. But one thing feels increasingly difficult to ignore. There is something deeply significant buried at that site. And the more I researched this story, the more one question stayed in my mind. What if those early Christians actually knew something that history slowly forgot? What if oral traditions survived through generations until believers eventually built a church directly above the place they believed Peter once lived? because sometimes we underestimate the ability ancient communities had to preserve memory. And honestly, maybe that is what makes this entire story so fascinating. It is not just an archaeological excavation. It feels almost like listening to an echo traveling across centuries. Maybe they found Peter's house. Maybe they did not. But one thing feels impossible to deny. After 2,000 years, humanity is still digging through the earth searching for traces of the men who once, and honestly, that alone is already incredible.